Happy Friday and welcome to the latest episode of A Day with Dre. We've got a good one here for you today regarding the hot topic DEI, of course. But before we get into that, make sure you like, subscribe, and follow the podcast. And that's A Day with Dre, available to you on Spotify, YouTube, Instagram, TikTok. You can find it anywhere, Apple Podcasts. Just make sure you give a like, follow, subscribe, leave a comment, do whatever you can to support the podcast. I really appreciate it. It helps get this out to more people and keep this thing going. So yeah, today we're going to talk about the DEI issue, or if you aren't watching and just listening, issue in air quotes, because that's the new scapegoat for everything. It's, in my opinion, a dog whistle. And if you don't know what a dog whistle is, that's, dog whistle is something that dogs can only hear. So a dog whistle is some type of coded or, key phrase that is representing something that to the obvious is kind of hiding in plain sight. So what that means is, like, for example, dog whistles are typically used politically. And we have like phrases like super predators, thugs, etc. These are dog whistles for Black people, right? So if you call out a person for using the term thug or super predator or welfare queen, right, the person using it can say, why are you making this about race, when they know damn well that they're talking about people from a specific group, right? Or they'll say, like, what about Chicago? What about Baltimore? Urban, inner city, woke, right? These are all dog whistles for Black people. And then more recently, we had things like woke, CRT, affirmative action, BLM, and now I think the newest dog whistle is DEI, right? And DEI is being used as the scapegoat for everything. And what does DEI actually stand for? It's diversity, equity, and inclusion. And what does that mean? Well, it means a lot of things, but to an average, not very well educated person, they hear DEI, they think of Black people, maybe brown people, and probably something in the LGBTQ community, right? When it means so much more than that. So let's talk about these things and why they're the target. And let's get a good understanding what DEI means. So DEI means diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what is diversity? It's the presence of different people, different dimensions of humanity represented in a place, right? But that's not limited to race, age, sex, orientation, gender expression, whatever, however you want to put it, ethnicity, marital status, or physical ability status, right? It just means you have a mix of all those different things. Equity. What does equity mean? Equity is the fair and just allocation of resources, right? So not only are you having diverse places, but the ability to have resources is fair and just. So it doesn't mean given. It just means there's fair and just allocation. And then inclusion is the intentional, ongoing effort to make sure that diversity and equity are just constantly being applied, right? You're trying to include everybody so they can participate with respect and with dignity. So if you can explain to me how a single one of those things is bad in any field, then I don't know, you're a winner, because nowhere in there does it say, make sure you value these things above the ability to perform an action, right? It's just saying, make sure that you're involving all people that can probably perform this job or perform this action, and not limit it to most, because whether you believe it or not, all humans have this thing called implicit bias. And what that is a bias you don't think about. Our country is white, right? That's the majority. The workforces are white, and people tend to hire to seek out people that are similar to themselves, whether it's intentional or not. It's just a reflexive response. And I'm not saying that's racism. That's, you can add whatever term you want to that, but when you're excluding a lot of people without even thinking about it, we need different policies in place to make sure that other people aren't, excluded from opportunity. And of course, that's just me trying to be optimistic, because in the US, people are purposely excluded from opportunity and we have a long history of purposely excluding people from opportunity. So why are these things important today, and why is it a target? Because a lot of people in our country aren't doing too hot, right? It's, unless you're super rich, it's harder to get by. It's getting harder and harder every day for people that aren't making a lot of money. And it's important for people to be able to pick a reason why. We probably have a economic collapse incoming, and it's important for a group of people to point their finger at something and say, this is why you're doing bad. This is why you're failing. And the easy thing to do is point at, minority groups of people. So it's easy to point the blame at that and say, our institutions are failing because they care more about DEI. They care more about including people in diversity than they care about more important things like making sure our institutions aren't falling apart. And what's crazy about that is, it's just, if you replace the words of the past few years, if you replaced woke, if you replaced DEI, if you replaced BLM, whatever, popular phrase of the summer is, and you said Jewish people, you tell me who that sounds like. And all of a sudden people start getting really uncomfortable, but it's the same type of rhetoric. It is the exact same type of rhetoric. But you say that and people start getting real uncomfortable, and they're like, well, don't compare this to that. And I just want to say that's how a lot of that stuff started. You get a overwhelming majority population of people and start getting them to point fingers at certain policies, certain people, and ostracizing certain people. And, it turns into saying, well, they just can no longer, people that work in these things can no longer have these jobs, and it just snowballed. And I'm not saying that we're headed towards Holocaust here in America, but the ideology is not too far off. So, and that's, again, maybe that's just my tinfoil hat getting a little too crazy, but that's unfortunately what it sounds like. So again, you get a country that's majority white that has a history of wanting to discriminate against minorities, and the history is also still active, let's be honest. But if you can convince them that programs focused on diversity, equity, and inclusion are the reasons why their lives aren't maybe succeeding in the way that they want, and then you get their support to get rid of all these diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives. And this isn't new. This has been going on for years. Just not too distantly, there was this big push for affirmative action. And again, affirmative action means a lot of things. It means you can't discriminate or deny people based on race, disability, gender, ethnic origin, and age for jobs, for, college admissions, etc. But once again, people hear affirmative action, and first and foremost, they think of Black people, and then, maybe brown people, maybe women, etc. Not that those things can't all overlap, but I think what's most notable about this is things that are associated with Black people. You can quickly get the country to say that these things are bad, or these dog whistles that are used are a lot more accepted as long as they don't actually say the words, Black people or brown people or whatever. But that's just kind of America in a nutshell, right? You can talk about those people as long as you don't say the words directly, and everybody knows who you're talking about, and they'll say, he's obviously talking about, or they're obviously talking about this group of people. And then it seems like a lot of the portrayers of this anti-DEI, anti-wokeness or whatever are from the conservative side of the political aisle, which is not even conservative anymore, because right now using executive orders to change the landscape of things is the opposite of conservative politics. It's fascism hiding as conservative politics, and fascism and conservatism, at least from the American politics side, are not the same thing. But we are seeing where some of those ideals are starting to overlap. But yeah, so again, this has been building up for years, and you keep pushing the majority population further and further to the right and keep blaming groups of the minority for issues that aren't actually their fault, then turn around and say, well, actually it's the government. They're playing this crazy psychological game where they're making the government, or the former government administration, the portrayers of this agenda. So they're saying the former administration is propping up these people that don't deserve these things. They're taking away these positions from you guys, the people that actually deserve it. So they're not directly blaming, your black and brown person while still also making them a part of the problem. So it's like a nice political and psychological game where you can't call them out because they're not directly saying that this is the Mexican immigrant's fault, or this is the gay person's fault, this is the black person's fault. They're saying this is the former administration's fault for prioritizing those people. So it's almost two birds. They're making the group of people the enemy while also saying the former administration is at fault for letting them get to these positions, and we're going to fix all of that for you. We're not going to care about age, sex, gender, race, ethnicity, whatever. Insert stratifying statement. We only care about merit. And yeah, we'll see how that works out. There's never been an America that only cares about merit. It just doesn't exist at all. But all right, where did the origins of DEI in the government come from? Because President Trump wants DEI to be, it's effectively banned from every type of federal office, government office at the federal level, with strong emphasis and push for the private sector to also follow suit. But what is DEI in the government? Where does it come from? Where does it look like? So there was an executive order, I think it was Lyndon B. Johnson after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which it banned discrimination in federal employment, required the government to take affirmative action to ensure that all applicants can be employed and receive proper treatment without regard to their race, creed, color, or national origin. All right, so that was like the first government law at the federal level for DEI, and Trump actually rescinded that executive action, stating that, to quote, critical and influential institutions of America's society have adopted and actively used dangerous, demeaning, and immoral race and sex-based preferences under the guise of diversity, equity, and inclusion. So what I say to that is, if you look at any government page and you look at well, it's already going to look different. But if you would have looked at people employed and seen, I don't know, a few people of color, a few women, but still more than likely majority of white people on that page, white guys, to be honest, probably, minus, I don't know, maybe some office every here and there. And you get a bunch of, let's be honest, is white men primarily. It's white people, but white men more so than white women. But they're in on it too, complaining about DEI, not knowing that white women are actually the biggest beneficiaries for DEI. But again, they see people of color, they see black people, they see brown people, South Asian people, whatever. They see dark-skinned people and say that's DEI, but don't realize that DEI is why, there's a physically or maybe mentally impaired person that gets the job as the greeter at Kroger or at Walmart, or understands that's why there are initiatives to hire veterans at a lot of places, or that's why parental leave has been expanded to mothers and fathers, where it just didn't used to exist at all. You could just not hire a woman out of fear that they may become pregnant. But that kind of discrimination was outlawed. But if you have 100 jobs and you see 20 of them go to black people, it's showing ignorance, and it's showing, honestly, racism, because you're saying that those people weren't deserving of that job based on merit. They got the job because of what they look like, without any evidence that that's why that person got the job. But you have people that see people of a certain look, certain color, and they just assume that they got hired for a quota, for numbers, and not hired because they can actually do the job. And that's really what it comes down to. Again, it's just bigotry. It's ignorance. And I don't see how people aren't seeing that. They don't think of it as, all these different things that help bring more people to the table. They just think it's excluding them from the table. And it's a shame, but that's where we live. That's who we are. And the executive order was effective for the federal government, but already big companies in the private sector have followed, right? Or they knew it was coming and they already started to implement some of these things, because this has been part of Trump's plan publicly for a little while. So you have things such as Walmart, right? Yeah, because that's such a small company, owing Lowe's, Ford, Target, etc. You know, they're sponsoring these things that are committed to diversity, equity, and inclusion. So they have walked back a lot of these things. Amazon walked back a lot of these things because they're going to just be committed to making as much money as possible instead of, making sure they're not discriminating against certain people getting a job. And you could say, well, we don't need laws to not discriminate against people, but like, let's be honest. This is the United States. We need laws for everything because people are going to push the limits of something, or just blatantly, even if there is a law, they're going to do something that's probably not acceptable. For example, I said that the executive order was signed for the Civil Rights Act was signed in 1964. The executive order followed it in 65, but there were still states that were segregated, or schools that were segregated up until the early 70s. So even if there are laws in place, people still won't follow, but at least a law tries to set a precedent, right? Like this idea that you don't need laws to direct morality, and that we're going to do what's right without being told to do what's right and let the businesses and free market determine what's right is crazy. But you notice most of the people that are saying it are the ones that might benefit from the lack of regulation, because they're the ones that know that, well, things might start benefiting them even more if they're allowed to step on people below them or beneath them even more on the social hierarchy. But yeah, so DEI is now again just the lazy scapegoat to blame everything on. So we talked about places that, or businesses that decided that they were going to no longer go with their DEI initiatives. But, to their credit, there are a few places that, and more than a few, but some notable places that decided to stand by their DEI measures. Costco, it's a more popular one. They decided to stick with DEI measures. The biggest company that notably is sticking by their DEI efforts is Apple. And to be honest, I'm not going to celebrate a company that's going to just do what's right. So I guess I'm glad they didn't decide to go against their initiatives for treating anybody and everybody like a worthy human. But you shouldn't be celebrated for that. That should be the standard, the baseline. So shame on all the places that decided to go against those efforts. But I guess kudos to the places that decided to continue on those efforts. So DEI again is just it's the new dog whistle. It's the new scapegoat. But I promise you, DEI is not why your life is harder. DEI is not what's wrong with America. Unless, of course, your idea of America is the place where white people are supposed to be in control of everything and be the, at the top of the caste system. Then yes, in that sense, DEI is probably what's wrong with America. But with that being said, DEI has existed and white people still are at the top of the caste system. So apparently it's not undoing anything. And for those of you that are convinced that DEI is causing all of these issues, I'd be interested in just having a conversation about how and why. But this thing about DEI is, it's so ridiculous, and Donald Trump is so ridiculous. It's things that have nothing to do with diversity, equity, and inclusion are being blamed on diversity, equity, and inclusion. So, of course, DEI was blamed on the wildfires in California because California has the mayor, Karen Bass, is our first black woman to run the city. And then the fire chief is the first woman and first openly gay person to run the fire department. So, of course, they're saying that their progressive values distracted them from public safety, but no one wants to focus on the fact that budget cuts are actually what severely jeopardize public safety. And the budget cuts were, of course, pushed by who? The more conservative side of the California government. And they say that, well, they still would have had funding for these things, but they decided to use that funding for DEI initiatives instead of taking any of the blame. Again, there's failures across the board, but instead it's just finger pointing and they're blaming DEI because I guess if there would have been no commitment to making sure all people were able to, have jobs in the California government, then somehow there wouldn't have been fires or there would have been more water or something. There wouldn't have been a drought. That's the logic that people are using. And when the president and the most powerful person in the world on paper, and then the richest person on the world are also, pushing these talking points, they just get stronger and stronger. And to not be outdone, the plane crash recently near DC, DEI is being blamed on the plane crash, albeit the pilot was a white guy. There was a military helicopter that crashed into a commercial plane. The first time that's happened in decades, and it's being blamed on the Biden administration and DEI. And Trump said we have to have our smartest people as air traffic controllers. It doesn't matter what they look like, how they speak, who they are. They have to be talented, naturally talented, geniuses. You can't have regular people doing their job. They won't be able to do it. We'll have to restore faith in American air travel. End quote. So, first of all, I didn't know that faith was lost in American air travel. Secondly, Trump, they had a bunch of people either not be hired, forced to resign, etc., regarding air traffic controllers and in the FAA. And that happened under the first few days of Trump's presidency. And then the report comes out that there was understaffing and that could have participated in the reason there was a plane crash. And somehow this is Biden's fault. And keep in mind, no incidences of this happened under Biden's presidency. But now that he's not the president anymore and it happens 10 days into the Trump presidency, somehow it's Biden's fault and somehow it's DEI's fault. And it just doesn't make sense. And then you have Laura Ingraham on Fox. Let's see if I have the clip here. So there's a FAA, the Federal Aviation Administration spokesperson, saying they want to have people from indigenous schools, HBCUs, schools with high Latino populations to be more involved in the FAA, and that's from 2023. And they're bringing it up now to say, and this is why this plane crash happened, because they're more focused on this. Keep in mind, there were no plane crashes during the previous administration with commercial and military fighters. And then all of a sudden that department gets gutted. Elon's forcing people to resign because he's worried they're going to keep fighting with him over SpaceX and things like that. And then not even 2 full weeks into the presidency, there's a plane crash and all of a sudden it's Biden's fault or it's DEI's fault. It's, the government's too focused on being woke, and it's ridiculous. And then, not to be outdone, there's a report that just came out that, Florida, and this is kind of a shift of the tone, but Florida recently had their worst reading and math and science scores in 20 years. And this is following their big campaign on, stop woke, or whatever they called it, stop the woke. That they campaigned that wokeness was destroying their schools, wokeness was doing all these bad things to their schools, and they banned all these books, and they got back to, what real education is, just for them to hit some of the worst education scores in their life. And somehow that's going to be DEI's fault too, even though they banned it a couple years ago in Florida. And all I did was make their education worse, apparently. And it almost reminds me of, what's his name? Is it Tim Robinson? And that he's got that show, I Think You Should Leave. And there's that stupid viral skit of him in the hot dog costume, and they crash the hot dog shaped car into a building, and all these people are trying to, they're all pissed off, and he's like, we need to figure out who did this, as he's wearing his hot dog costume. And that's just the GOP right now, right? They're things that are literally results of their actions. And they're looking around like, we need to figure out who did this. And it's just it's like the most obvious, you did this ever. But again, it's not exclusive to the GOP because politicians want to blame everybody but themselves. But this is just egregious. This is like the most obvious, like, bro, come on. Nobody wants to actually focus on maybe pushing the country in a better direction. We just want to blame, fight, divide. And the more divided we get, the easier we are to conquer. And it's a real shame so many people are falling right into this. But if you think somehow making diversity, equity, and inclusion in jobs and in the government is a bad thing, if you think more people having access to important jobs, important roles, it doesn't even have to be important, just any job, any role is a bad thing, then you're a problem. Even if DEI just meant black people, it's not a problem. There's nothing wrong with saying that black people have historically been discriminated against. They need more accessibility and equity. If it was just for women, there's nothing wrong with that. If it was just for disabled people, there's nothing wrong with that. If it was just for veterans, there's nothing wrong with that. Groups of people that have historically been discriminated against, there's nothing wrong with initiatives just for that group of people. But the fact is, it's not just for a specific group of people, it's for all people. And you're letting inclusivity make you feel like people are taking away from you, then that's your own issue. It's like when people were freaking out about the pause on Medicare, Medicaid, WIC, SNAP, etc., and they let the government pause all the federal programs, and then the outcry from it led to the government saying there was just some glitch. Like, come on. And people are just saying, oh yeah, there's just a glitch. Why would the government want to pause? Because they're assholes. And they paused all federal funding for all these federal programs. And then coincidentally, there just happened to be a glitch when everybody was pissed off that Medicare, Medicaid, and food stamps portals were no longer working. Like, it was intentional, and then there was a backfire. So then they changed the story. Yet people are just eating up what they say because, well, Trump can't tell a lie, as if he's not one of the most well-known liars. I mean, he's blaming stuff on DEI when his administration was one of the administrations that was encouraging disabled people to be in the FAA, and that's documented. And then he'll turn around and be like, Biden did this, and y'all just eat it up. It's so crazy. It is so crazy, and it's so disappointing. There's so many people that I thought of as smart people, as critical thinkers, that just don't think. They just hear and say, all right, he's right. We got to do what he says. And there's just not an ounce of objectivity to it. And it's so disappointing. And you should question all your leaders, to be honest. It's not just the ones that the ones that you support, you should question even more because you hold them to a higher standard. But yeah, so for all the people that said that this was about eggs and somehow DEI is the reason that eggs are even more expensive already, and when these tariffs go in place and everything costs even more, hopefully not permanently, but there's going to be an adjustment period, that's for sure. Somehow DEI is going to be the reason for that too, and people are just going to be like, well, Trump said it, so it must be true. And all of the other people in the GOP that follow suit are going to be like, Trump said it, so it must be true. And somehow it's just going to probably get worse. But yeah, DEI is it's the newest dog whistle. And, in a few months, there'll probably be a new one. And again, while DEI doesn't mean it's not made just for black people. It's not made just for brown people. It's not made just for gay people or trans people or women. But all of those people fit under the umbrella of DEI. So DEI helps all of those people. It helps veterans. A lot of people that are upset about it don't realize that it helps all of those different groups of people. And instead they think that it's just helping people like me. Instead, they think it's helping black people get into these positions that they don't deserve to be in. And it's a shame. And I think it was Lyndon B. Johnson back in the 60s or something like that said that to get poor white people on your side, all you got to do is make them feel superior to black people. And that's still proven to be true over and over and over again today. And I paraphrased what he said. That's not the exact quote, but the quote is essentially saying that all you got to do for support is convince white people that black people are beneath them or the problem. And like I said a little earlier, sounds like a person in the mid 1930s over in Europe that got a lot of traction really quickly for finding a group of people to blame for things that weren't necessarily their fault. And it's a little more complicated than just blaming black people, but black people are they're involved in that group of people with DEI, and it's probably the one that people think of the most that benefit from DEI, when that is obviously not the case. So of course you get a bunch of people to be against it. But with that said, it is Black History Month, and I think to combat this idiotic anti-DEI nonsense, I'm going to drop some episodes with certain themes like DEI in healthcare, DEI in, I don't know, business, or, how does DEI, why is it necessary? Why are there socioeconomic differences in these groups of people? And I'm going to focus on Black people because, of course, that's my vested interest, and it is Black History Month. So stay tuned for that. Again, appreciate you sitting here listening to another episode of A Day with Dre podcast. Again, I'm available on Spotify, Apple Podcast, video episodes on YouTube. Check out the TikTok, check out the Instagram. Please leave a comment, like, subscribe, share, so we can continue to grow this thing. And let's have a good Black History Month. All right, appreciate it.